Hello, everyone, and welcome to my review of The Last of Us TV show episode 3. As usual, the first part of this video will be spoiler free in case you haven't seen the episode yet or played the game. And after that, I will warn you when I start talking about spoilers. So let's just get right into it, all right? So my non-spoiler thoughts about the episode. Well, I will say that this is the long-awaited episode with Bill in it. Bill being a character from the game. And I will say that if you've played the game, it does nothing to prepare you for what actually happens in this episode. Not at all. This is the episode that departed from the game the most. Like 99% of it isn't even in the game. Did I like the episode? Well, yes, I did like it. I mean, it was entertaining, but I do have issues with it from a writer's perspective, which I will talk about more in the spoiler section. The parts with Joel and Ellie were actually my favorite parts for once. I actually liked Ellie in this episode, which was a pleasant surprise. She felt like Ellie is supposed to be, finally. And I think there was some really great moments between her and Joel. So my hope is renewed for Bella Ramsey's Ellie, and that makes it a lot easier to look forward to the rest of the episodes. And I'm also really loving Pedro Pascal's Joel. Every episode makes me love him more and more. I think he's doing a great job as Joel, and he brings just the right amount of toughness and brokenness to the character, and it's so easy to feel all the feels when he's on the screen. I couldn't be happier. There was some more exposition about the outbreak that was really interesting, so I enjoyed that. Overall, I think it was a fine episode. Probably won't be my favorite one of the series, but I didn't dislike it. I think if it had ended differently, I wouldn't be as disappointed with it as I am. And I will explain that in the spoiler section, which I suppose I should get to now, since there's really not a lot else I can say without giving things away. So, if you haven't seen the episode and don't want to be spoiled, stop watching now and stick this video in your watch later and come back later. So, let's get into this with spoilers. I am going to talk about this episode in order this time, in order of events, because I want to talk about Joel and Ellie before I start talking about Bill and Frank. Joel and Ellie are the main characters after all, and the story is, or at least is supposed to be, about them, and their part is first. Like I said before, I really liked the Joel and Ellie parts. It starts with Joel by the edge of a river making a tower with rocks, and you just know it's a monument to Tess. He's having a private moment to grieve in his own way, and I found it to be very in character for him. He cared about Tess, but he never let himself feel deep love for her because he doesn't want to put himself in the position of losing someone he loves like he lost Sarah. It's just, too painful to go through again. And so he's kept this hard crust over his heart for so long, refusing to feel the emotions of attachment and unable and unwilling to feel the emotions of grief. So the solemn building of a rock tower in private is all Joel can manage, but for him, that's a lot. And I love that. And after that, he returns to Ellie, and she confronts him about the fact that he shouldn't blame her for Tess's death, since no one forced him to do the job of transporting Ellie. And you can see the look on Joel's face, and you can tell that he realizes that's what he was doing, blaming Ellie for what happened. He gives her a little nod, basically saying, "You're right, it wasn't your fault." And that is the last tense moment between the two of them. And I didn't mind Ellie's attitude in this scene either because it felt warranted. She could tell that Joel was blaming her for what happened, and that was unjustified, and she defended herself. She wasn't just being a brat this time. In fact, even though she was confronting him yet again, it just wasn't the same as all the other times. She wasn't just being a brat in this scene, so I actually liked it. So they continue on their journey to Bill's town, and we get a bunch of shots of them walking and talking about different things. I loved the scene where Ellie starts asking Joel questions about the area, about the types of enemies he's watching out for. She asks him about the scar on his head and how he got it. It was from a bullet that grazed him because the shooter missed, and Joel missed when he shot back. And Joel says it happens more often than you think. And Ellie asks if that's just in general or because Joel's just a bad shot. And Joel says in general. I had to chuckle at that one, though, because it seems like it's to console the player of the game who frequently misses their shots. Don't feel bad. It's perfectly normal to miss quite often. And throughout this entire scene, Ellie is perfectly friendly and conversational with Joel, just like she's supposed to be. So the scene was fun. And Ellie's good-natured ways continue into the next scene, where they arrive at an old convenience store where Joel had stashed some stuff a couple years ago for emergencies. And there's an old Mortal Kombat arcade game in the store, and Ellie is excited to see it, wishing she could play it, saying that a friend told her all about it. And this scene is actually in the game. It's one of those little moments that happen during gameplay that you could totally miss if you don't go into a certain building or if you're not nearby to Ellie when she notices it. And also in the scene, Ellie asks Joel if there's anything bad in the store, and Joel says, "Just you." And Ellie doesn't even roll her eyes. In fact, there wasn't a single eye roll in this entire episode. So happy about that. Something a bit weird did happen when they were in that store, though. Ellie goes down into the basement where she's surprised by an infected person who had been buried during a cave-in. The infected is still alive, but he can't move under all the rubble. So Ellie approaches him, and for some reason, she cuts a gash across his forehead with her knife, like she's studying him or something. And he just watches her, and then she suddenly just stabs him through the eye, killing him. I thought it was kind of a strange scene to have in there. Not sure what it means. Is Ellie just being curious about the infected? I mean, she is technically infected. She's just asymptomatic, right? So maybe she's curious about what might be under her own skin, because she does have evidence of those veiny tendrils under her skin right around her bite. It's creepy to think about. After this, we get some more exposition about the outbreak, this time from Joel. Ellie asks him how it happened, and he tells her how the cordyceps had contaminated some flour or sugar in factories, and it all got distributed around the world. And if you eat enough of it, you get infected. And he specifically mentioned pancake mix, sort of with a melancholy tone, because in episode 1, before the outbreak, Sarah wanted to make him some pancakes for breakfast, but they were out of pancake mix, and they avoided getting infected like everyone else. But also because Joel forgot to get the birthday cake, and they also didn't try the neighbor's biscuits, and Sarah didn't have any of the neighbor's cookies because they had raisins in them, and she didn't like raisins. This whole idea that the fungus was in the flour was a theory going around after episode 1 came out, but it's not just a theory anymore. Anyway, Ellie actually thanks Joel for telling her all that, just continuing her pleasant demeanor, and I'm only pointing out each and every instance of it because it's so appreciated. And then we get a moment where we can see Joel caring about Ellie for the first time. He stops her on the road and says they should cut across the woods, even though walking on the road would be easier. He admits that there's something on the road ahead that he doesn't want her to see. Ellie insists on seeing it, though, since he admits that it can't hurt her, and it ends up being a very sad sight of hundreds of human skeletons on the side of the road, all of them lying next to old suitcases. Joel tells her how a week after Outbreak Day, soldiers rounded up whole towns full of people and said they'd be taken to a QZ, but only if there was room. And if there wasn't room, they just shot them all, even though they weren't infected. Because, as Joel said, dead people can't be infected. It's a sad moment for Ellie, as she's discovering the harsh reality of life outside the quarantine zone. But it's a moment that Joel actually tried to protect her from experiencing. He didn't have to do that. Joel from episode 1 probably wouldn't have. He wouldn't have cared if Ellie saw a disturbing sight or not. So it's just a nice little moment to show a smidgen of character growth, and I liked it. But yeah, the scene with all the skeletons was sad, especially when it zooms in on an adult skull beside a very small child's skull. and the cloth from their clothing is flapping in the breeze. And then it fades to a flashback of Outbreak Day. And front and center are the very same pieces of cloth, only now you know it's the shirt of a woman and the blanket of her baby she's carrying. And they're all being loaded into trucks to be taken to the QZ. But you know they never make it there. And that ends the first bit about Joel and Ellie with that transition to the flashback. So now I'll talk about the next hour of the episode, which isn't about Joel and Ellie at all, but rather about Bill and Frank. Don't worry, I am not going to do a scene-by-scene analysis of this part, but I do have a lot to say about it. Now, I knew it was going to be the episode where they go to Bill's town, because I've played the game and that's what comes next in the game. And I knew that they would show a flashback of Bill meeting Frank, and even Bill meeting Joel early on after the outbreak, because I saw the trailer for this episode. However, after watching that trailer, I had assumed that the episode would start with a flashback of Bill and Frank, similar to how the first two episodes started with flashbacks, and then the rest of the show would be about the present time with Joel and Ellie. But no, that's not what we got. We got 15 minutes of Joel and Ellie at the beginning, and then an entire hour of Bill and Frank's great romance in the apocalypse. Bill is this paranoid prepper survivalist that hides out in his basement bunker as the feds ship everyone in his town off to the quarantine zones. And so he's left all alone in his town, which becomes Bill's town, and he fortifies it, putting up a perimeter fence and traps of all kinds, and he becomes quite self-sufficient. And that is basically Bill from the game, too. But then 4 years later, Frank gets caught in one of Bill's traps, and the two start a insta-love romance, which I don't really like insta-love romances. But anyways, we follow them through the next 16 years, up until the time when Joel and Ellie finally arrive. They build a life for themselves and they're happy. But eventually, Frank gets sick. Not sure what he's sick from, but it puts him in a wheelchair and it affects his fine motor skills as well. And Frank gets tired of living, and so he persuades Bill to help him commit suicide by crushing up a bunch of pills and putting them in his wine. But Bill puts pills in his own wine as well, and they both die together sometime before Ellie and Joel show up. And when they do show up, they find a letter that Bill wrote to explain everything. And Bill leaves all his stuff to Joel and admonishes Joel about not letting himself love people, the fact that Joel doesn't let himself love people, because Bill came to learn that that having someone to love is more important than anything else. And Bill is a truck and it has a battery, and so Joel and Ellie are able to resupply and be on their way with zero effort, basically, and little impact. The end. Now, you can probably tell I'm not just a huge fan of this entire sequence, and I am going to explain why. So in the game, we learn that Bill and Frank were probably a couple. It's not stated with certainty that they are, but it is implied. And the showrunners decided to elaborate on their relationship quite a bit for the show. And fine, I don't really mind that. I figured they would. It is a show after all, and the show can afford to put more detail into things than a game can. What I don't really appreciate, though, is that they took a show about Joel and Ellie and made it a show about Bill and Frank. True, it is just one episode, but there are only going to be 9 of them, so that real estate is kind of precious. And to devote an entire episode to 2 side characters who have no real impact on the main plot and who don't even interact with the main characters seems like a weird decision to make. Don't get me wrong, I seriously don't mind that they showed us Bill's life before Joel and Ellie. I was actually kind of looking forward to seeing it. I thought it was interesting, lighthearted most of the time, but heartbreaking and emotional too. I thought it was told well, and the acting was on par. I mean, I think Nick Offerman was a perfect casting for Bill, and I liked Frank. I thought there were some genuinely funny moments in it too. I just wish they hadn't focused on it as much as they did, because it felt like a story that didn't belong in this series. And just in case you're wondering, my opinion about this part of the show really has nothing to do with the fact that Bill and Frank are gay. I would have had the same opinions about it even if Bill's love interest was a woman. It just felt out of place to me, at least to the degree that they showed us. And it does make me wonder, if Bill's love interest in the game had been a woman, would they have devoted so much time to this backstory as they did? Probably not. Anyway, I thought it just dragged out too much. Never once while I was playing the game did I ever sit back and think, gee, I wish I could see a really long flashback about Bill. And you know why I never thought that? Because the game told us all we needed to know about Bill, and he served a certain purpose for the story, and he served it well. Bill in the game is a great character and an important one. One of the great things about The Last of Us, the game, is that it has so few characters in it, but each and every one of them serves the plot in different ways, and each of them impacts the main characters in certain ways. No one is superfluous. No one is there just for padding or fluff. But that's what this episode of the show felt like to me. Fluff and padding that ground the pacing of the show to a halt and has no bearing on the story at large. And take out this Bill and Frank hour and the story will progress exactly the same. The story won't miss it. And as a writer, things like this bother me. No matter how great a side story is, if it doesn't affect the main story in some intrinsic way, then it's fluff and should be cut out. No matter how great a side character is, if you can cut them out of the story without affecting the plot or the development of the main character at all, then they are pointless and should not exist. Bill in the game is important for the main plot, yes, but also important for Joel's character growth. If you cut him out of the game, several things don't happen. But if you cut Bill out of the show, nothing really changes. The show can easily go on without him. And I'll explain that a little more. First, if you haven't played the game, I'll tell you a little bit about Bill and what happens in Bill's section of the game, because I know some of you guys that are watching this haven't played the game yet. The show gives us Bill from the game at first, a loner, paranoid prepper that sets traps and is perfectly happy all by himself in his own little world. He doesn't want visitors, and he doesn't want to make friends with anyone. He grudgingly helps Joel and Ellie when they go to him for a car so they can drive to Wyoming. Joel and Bill do have a history like in the show. In fact, Bill owes Joel a favor, and the only reason he helps them is because of that favor. And throughout this sequence in Bill's town, we learn that Bill had a partner, someone he cared about, who was obviously not in Bill's life anymore. Bill thinks that Joel is crazy for taking on the job of smuggling Ellie across the country, and he tells Joel to lose her, because it's not worth it getting attached to someone. Having people close to you is a liability and will only get you killed. And later we find out that Bill's partner Frank killed himself because he didn't want to lose his mind after getting bit by infected. And we also find out that Bill and Frank had some sort of falling out. We're not given the details about the relationship or how they met and how long they known each other or the exact details of how they split up. All of that doesn't really matter to the story. All we know is that Frank got tired of Bill's paranoia and the way he ran his town, and so he left to try to join the Boston QZ. But he never made it there. And we also learn that Frank stole a lot of Bill's things, including a battery in a truck that Bill wanted. The very same battery that Bill was taking Joel and Ellie to go get, which they find missing. But later when they find Frank's body, it's near a truck that he had placed the battery into so that he could get out of town. And by the way, props to the show for making the truck the same make, model, and color as the one in the game. I noticed it right away. Anyway, now this sequence obviously serves the plot in that it gets Joel and Ellie a ride. And true, they don't really need Bill for that. They could have found a battery on their own without his help. And so a lot of people point out that Bill is useless because of that. But I think that those people don't really see beyond that practical function. They don't understand what is the most important part of this sequence. And that is the relationship between Bill and Ellie and how it affects and changes Joel. And in the show, there is no relationship between Bill and Ellie. They actually never meet each other because Bill dies before Ellie even comes to his town. So in the game, Bill and Ellie don't get off on the right foot, and they pretty much hate each other from the get-go, causing Joel to play referee most of the time. The verbal abuse that Ellie gets from Bill triggers Joel's protective fathering instincts, and he ends up having to defend Ellie several times, which he's done many times before now, defended her life at least. But now he must defend her honor and her feelings. And you see something change in Joel during this sequence. Joel begins to care about Ellie enough to defend her against a guy who cares nothing for her. Joel cares about Ellie's feelings. He doesn't want her to be emotionally hurt by Bill. And prior to this sequence, Joel really couldn't care less about Ellie's feelings. We see that change take place here. And by the end of this sequence, Joel is actually complimenting and encouraging Ellie for the first time, telling her that she's doing a good job, countering Bill's constant insistence that Ellie is dead weight, which is what Joel used to think she was. And because of Joel's defense of her, Ellie is drawn closer to him as well. Not because she needs to be defended, she's pretty capable of standing up for herself just fine, but because she knows that Joel is on her side. She can trust him to have her back, even when her life isn't being threatened, and the only thing on the line is her dignity. And another thing that Bill served to do was to show Joel what the future would likely be for him if he continued pushing people away and not allowing himself to become attached or to love. The whole quest to find the battery was actually the side plot here. Okay? They could have found a battery in any manner of different ways to move the plot along, like I said before, but it would have lacked that overarching character development that is actually what the story is about. The character development in The Last of Us is what makes it a great story. Without it, it's just a plot about two people trying to get from point A to point B without dying. A great writer-YouTuber that I like by the name of Abby Emmons has this to say about it. The external conflict, the plot, is all about what happens, but the internal conflict, the story, is why it matters. And I love this. It's the ultimate key to writing great fiction. Link to Abby Emmons' channel in the description, by the way. Such great writing advice there. Anyway, this sequence in Bill's town has a plot. Find the battery so Joel and Ellie can drive the truck to Wyoming. But that's the external conflict that we don't really care about. It's the internal conflict of the characters that actually matters most here, that actually makes this part of the story worth telling. And it seems the showrunners didn't understand this because the changes they made completely remove all of it in favor of something else that doesn't even matter to the story or the characters of Joel and Ellie, whom the story is about. And if something in a story doesn't matter to the characters, then I have a hard time making it matter to me. And that is why I'm so disappointed in this episode, because it took all of that important character development for the main characters and replaced it completely with an hour-long romance between side characters who ultimately die by the end of the episode anyway, without even interacting with Joel and Ellie at all. Joel and Ellie do get the battery, but that's just the plot. The entire point is missing. Now, I know what some of you are probably going to say, but there was character development for Joel. The things that Bill wrote in his letter really hit home to him, and they're going to affect him in the future. And yes, I'm sure that that's what will happen. And yes, I agree that it was a nice moment to see Joel's reaction in the letter. I enjoyed it, and Pedro Pascal's acting made it very clear that Bill's words hit home to him. But you know what? In my opinion, the game still did it better, because it showed us the journey through that entire sequence with Bill, while the show just told us the Hallmark greeting card version that can be quite quickly and easily forgotten by Joel because he didn't experience the truth of it for himself like he did in the game. Now, I'm not saying that they shouldn't have put Bill's backstory in there. I think it's fine to include it. Backstory is great. I think it would have been interesting to see some backstory for Tess, to be honest. And I especially enjoyed the part of the backstory that had Tess and Joel meeting Bill and Frank for the first time. It was great to see Tess again, young and untroubled. It was great to see Bill and Joel realizing that they don't like each other. I wish we could have seen more interactions between Bill and Joel in the present time. And the reason this was my favorite part of the flashback is because it involved the main characters and it mattered to them, which made it matter to me. It felt more relevant than all the rest of it. So if it's not about the main character, then it needs to be minimal. So have some backstory for Bill. Show us how he met Frank. Show us their lives together. Make us care about them. Do all of that, but don't do it instead of the actual story. And for sure, connect it to the main story in a meaningful way, and then it will matter to me. My very first thought after watching this episode actually was this would have been so much better if the flashback had been 15 or 20 minutes long instead of an hour, and Frank had been killed in some tragic way, leaving Bill alone for a couple years or so before Joel and Ellie arrive. And by the time they arrive, Bill has become the miserable, bitter man that we know from the game, similar to how Joel became after losing Sarah. Then we could still have all those important character moments while Bill helps them find the car battery. We would have seen the interaction between Bill and Ellie that everyone was so much looking forward to, because let's face it, it's some of the funniest moments in the game. True, it would have put a more tragic end to Bill and Frank's story, but I don't think that's such a bad thing. They would have still had all those happy years, but it would be better to show the reality of the life they live in. You can't count on tomorrow. In their dangerous world, it's more likely that you won't die of old age or even a normal disease, and that you will die young. And the lesson to learn is that you should live what life you have to the fullest, loving the people in your life as fully as you can, because they are what make life worth living in the first place. And a tragic end does not diminish the happiness of the journey. And besides, I found it quite unbelievable that Bill and Frank survived as long as they did anyway. First rule of survival in the apocalypse: don't stick out like a sore thumb. Guess Bill forgot to read that chapter in the Survivalist's Handbook. He's got this pristine compound full of obvious resources and only gets attacked by raiders once in 20 years. Yeah, I don't buy that at all. Bill in the game didn't have a normal suburban lifestyle. He hoarded stuff in basements and kept all the buildings around his base looking just as broken and dilapidated as any others. That way, any passing raiders wouldn't immediately know that anyone was living there or that there were resources to be found there. I had to continually suspend my disbelief throughout this flashback that they were able to live so long in that place without tragedy happening. Especially when you stand out in the very middle of the road while you're shooting at raiders. Yeah, not a great move. And I would have been quite satisfied to see their story end with Frank getting killed in a raid. I think it would have been better than glorifying a double suicide at least. But you know what? Frank didn't even have to die. If they change it so much, why not just keep him alive in the first place and have Joel and Ellie come and just have Frank and Bill still living happily ever after? What? I don't understand. Anyway, those are my thoughts about the Bill and Frank part. What did you guys think? What did you think about my thoughts about it? I'm curious because from what I've seen so far, most people really like this episode and think it's amazing, the best episode so far. And I think it could have been the best episode so far if they hadn't cut out all the things that made this part of the story great in the first place. Anyway, moving on. Once Ellie and Joel finally arrive to Bill's place, Joel conveniently finds the truck in the garage and the battery being kept fresh in the fridge, and they don't need to exert any effort or endure any hardship or have any character growth to win these items. Everything's just handed to them. And one of Brandon Sanderson's rules of writing states that you should make your characters fail to achieve their goal at least 3 times before gaining success. Because when things are just handed to the characters with no effort to achieve it, well, it's boring. You can't root for them in their struggle. There's no suspense over whether or not they'll succeed. And so this part of the story really disappointed me too. In the game, they have to go through all sorts of struggle to get that battery. And at one point, they actually fail in their quest, risking their lives for nothing. But once they finally do get the battery, you can share in their relief because you went on that journey with them. You know what they had to go through to get there, and finding that battery and that truck at the end of it felt earned. Anyway, that's really all I have to say about things that I didn't like in this episode. I don't want to get too negative because there was still a lot about it that I did like. And so I think I'll wrap this up by talking about a few more of those things that I liked, just like I did in the last episode. I did like the scene where Ellie reads Bill's letter to Joel, simply because of Joel's reaction to it. When Ellie reads, "I leave you all of my weapons, use them to keep," and then she stops, not wanting to read the rest, and you can totally fill in the blanks. And when Joel takes the letter and reads it himself, you can see that it says, "Keep Tess safe," just like you thought it would. And suddenly Joel has a hard time keeping his emotions in check, so he tells Ellie to stay there and he rushes outside to have a moment by himself. He's overcome with grief, but he still fights so hard to keep it down. I thought it was a nice moment. And then when Joel goes back into the house, we get the conversation that they have in the game right after Tess dies. The one where Joel lays down some rules if Ellie's going to travel with him. We don't bring up Tess, you don't tell anyone about your condition or they'll shoot you, and do whatever I say when I say. And Ellie agrees without argument, just like in the game. I'm glad they put the scene in the show. And the reason they put it after getting to Bill's rather than right after Tess died is because in the show, Joel is planning on dropping Ellie off at Bill's and going separate ways. So he has no need to lay down the rules of traveling with him until he decides that he will take her with him and find Tommy, and maybe he can pass her off to Tommy. And he makes this decision after they resupply at Bill's. Whereas in the game, he's planning to take her all the way to Wyoming to find Tommy right after Tess dies, so he has to lay down the rules then. I think it works better in the game, though, since it establishes the rules before they ever start traveling together. But in the show, they've already been traveling together for a while, so it's kind of strange, but not really a huge deal in the end, just a tiny nitpick. I love the ongoing humor of Ellie trying to get Joel to give her a gun. It happens 3 times in this episode, and it happened at least once in the second episode. Every chance she gets, Ellie tries to convince Joel that she should carry a gun, and each time Joel says no. And what I especially liked in this episode was that Ellie didn't take it personally or get mad about it, like she did in the second episode. That scene where Ellie discovers that Bill and Frank have hot water. She's so excited and announces that she's going to take a shower and then states that Joel is going to take a shower too because he reeks. And the look on Joel's face, I love it. And showered and clean Joel was nice to see. He even combed his hair and put on fresh clothes. And Ellie also donned some new threads, some very familiar threads if you've played the game. Her iconic red t-shirt that so many people have cosplayed with, so that's nice to see. And then Ellie finds a gun in a drawer in Bill's house, and she takes it and hides it in her bag when Joel isn't looking. I'm curious to see what they do with that since this isn't in the game. Hopefully, it's used later in a scene that is in the game instead of a different gun, and that they don't make up some other crazy thing that happens. I'm crossing my fingers on that one. And then Joel and Ellie get into the truck and leave Bill's town, and Ellie is like a kid in a candy store riding in a vehicle, apparently for the first time. It's cute, and something that's not in the game. In the game, Ellie seems to be very familiar with vehicles. She even knows how to drive one somehow. I guess I always assumed that they had vehicles in the QZ. I mean, they do. Maybe only military vehicles, but Ellie was in a military training school, so there was a good chance she rode in one of the vehicles at some point. But still, the scene in the show was cute and brought a smile to my face. Then Ellie pulls an old cassette tape out of the glove box and puts it in the player. This happens in the game too, only in the game, the first song that comes on is "I'll Never Get Out of This Alive" by Hank Williams. And they changed it for the show to be "Long, Long Time" by Linda Ronstadt. And that's actually the name of the episode too, because that's the song that Bill sang and played on the piano right after meeting Frank. And they wanted it to be a poignant bookend to the story, I guess. Anyway, those were my thoughts about The Last of Us Episode 3. I know my take is probably a hot one, quite different from most of them out there, I think. But that's me. I'm a writer of fiction, and quality of story matters a lot to me. Again, let me know what you guys thought of this episode, and let me know what you think of my take on it. I'm curious if anyone else out there has the same issues with the show that I did. From what I've seen so far, I'm somewhat of a minority, I think. But I have only read the comments of a couple YouTube videos, so who knows. I'm really looking forward to the next episode, though, because it will be when they get to Pittsburgh, and a lot of really great moments happen in Pittsburgh. If you liked this video, give it a thumbs up because it really does help out the channel. And if you're a writer and would like some really great writing advice, do check out Abby Emmons' YouTube channel. It's some of the best writing advice on the internet by far. She'll change your life. She did mine. I'll see you guys in the next episode. And until then, remember to play safe, play nice, and have fun. Bye, guys.